Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, NERC Compliance, Adapting Strategy to Shifting Reliability Risks. We're excited to have you with us. Before we dive in, let's cover a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording and slides with you after the webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A panel. We'll address as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And finally, there is a CRA IT person on the call today. If you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat function to message him or her. For us, today's topic is critical as the NERC energy landscape continues to evolve. We'll examine how organizations can strengthen and adapt compliance strategies to proactively address emerging reliability risks. With that, let's get started. Before we start, here's a quick look at what's ahead over the next hour. We'll start with a brief introduction of myself and Brent to set the stage for our discussion. Next, we'll move into trend analysis, where we'll examine the key reliability and compliance trends shaping the industry right now. From there, we'll cover NERC strategic risk alignment, looking at how NERC's priorities are evolving and what that means for compliance strategies and compliance programs. Then we'll discuss key changes in industry risk priorities, highlighting what's shifting and why it matters for your organizations. Looking ahead, we'll explore 2026 and beyond, focusing on strategic considerations for the future. Finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So let's get started with our introductions. First, I'd like to introduce the team behind this webinar today, CRA's Reliability, Security, and Resilience team. Our team focuses on the reliability, security, and resilience of the grid by working with utilities, government agencies, and energy providers to develop resilient programs and strategies that strengthen reliability and security across the power grid. We focus on delivering comprehensive and strategic services in utility risk management, operations, and NERC compliance. I'm Kirsten Ma, an associate principal with CRA. I started my energy career over 16 years ago at WEC in the Compliance Enforcement Department. It was there that I oversaw and implemented the CMEP and rules of procedure and supported the implementation of initiatives such as the IRA and COPs for the West. Being part of the transition to risk-based compliance monitoring gave me a firsthand experience with policy shifts and the mechanisms that followed, including, a variety of new disposition methods like FFT, self-logging, and compliance exceptions. After WEC, I joined PacifiCorp's Regulatory Compliance Group, where I helped lead and support the FERC, NERC, and ISO 27001 programs. From there, my career guided me into energy consulting, which I've been doing for the last 7 years. In this role, I provide guidance to utilities across the US and Canada on matters such as strategic risk identification, enterprise-wide risk and internal controls assessments, resilience planning, NERC compliance, FERC and NERC policy analysis, and regulatory compliance program development. With that, I'll hand it over to Brent for his introduction.
Thank you, Kirsten. My name is Brent Reed. I'm an associate principal with Charles River Associates. My career started 21 years ago. I worked for a municipal utility in Texas, the city of College Station. In that organization, I did a little bit of everything. It was a small shop. I started out doing line design, project management. I eventually moved into real-time system operations, where I managed the control room. I went through audits. I went through TOP certification. I went through all of the various activities, including event analysis from the 2011 cold weather event. And then I moved to WEC, where I spent a couple of years in the enforcement and risk group before going back to Texas, where I spent 4 years managing the risk assessment team at Texas RE. I became a consultant shortly thereafter and have been helping clients as they manage the constantly shifting and changing risk-based landscape of the NERC compliance world. With that, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you. And as you guys can probably hear in our introductions, Brent and I have been following each other around here for the last decade or so. I'm so happy to be still working alongside him. Thank you, Brent. Let's move into trend analysis of risk profiles and risk elements. So this slide illustrates how NERC's risk priorities have shifted and evolved over time. If we look to the left of the slide, the pre-2012 era, this is kind of the traditional compliance model era. NERC's compliance monitoring and enforcement program focused on strict adherence to standards. Monitoring was largely uniform across entities, regardless of their risk profile. This is also when criticisms started to grow over inefficiencies and lack of focus on actual reliability risks. Moving into 2012 was the recognitions of inefficiencies era, we like to call it. This is when NERC acknowledged that the zero tolerance model was unsustainable. During this time, compliance efforts were more about avoiding penalties than improving reliability. We got to 2013, 2014, and NERC finally launched the RAI, or the Reliability Assurance Initiative, to shift toward a risk-based approach. This RAI approach introduced concepts like inherent risk assessments, compliance oversight plans, self-logging, and compliance exceptions. In 2015, FERC formally approved NERC's RAI implementation and then directed NERC to revise its rules of procedure to reflect these risk-based concepts. It also required an annual reporting on RAI progress. Moving into 2016 to 2020, we really started to see the risk-based CMEP starting to mature. Regional entities began tailoring compliance monitoring based on entity-specific risks, and NERC began refining its risk elements annually and aligned them with evolving threats. Moving into 2021 to 2023, we as an industry started to see the integration of emerging risks. So these were risk elements. They expanded to include items or elements such as supply chain vulnerabilities, extreme weather impacts, and inverter-based resources. Finally, we hit 2025. Just this last August, we saw the new the ERO risk report filed, followed by the updated CMEP IP, which brings us today and planning for 2026. Next slide, please. This table shows the ERO risk priorities from 2018 through 2025. 2018 was the first year the ERO put out the risk priorities report. Through 2025, the most recent. The Reliability Issues Steering Committee, or the RISC, is tasked with advising the NERC board of emerging reliability issues every 2 years, with the exception of 2018 to 2019, when they did it 1 year. And then from there on, they decided every 2 years was enough. This chart presents the results of those key risks identified beginning in 2018 through the most recent report published in August. Each bolded item represents a pivot point requiring new strategies, investments, and collaboration for your compliance departments. If we look at this chart to the left, we call it kind of the early years, 2018 to 2019. The focus here was on foundational reliability issues such as changing resource mix, bulk power system planning, and resource adequacy. In addition, risks related to human performance, situational awareness, and physical and cyber vulnerabilities were also prominent, this reflecting operational and compliance-driven priorities. Next, we go into a transition period in 2021. The emphasis began to pivot toward broader systemic challenges. Notably here, grid transformation emerged as a dominant theme, signaling the industry's move toward modernization and integration of new technologies. Also, security risks and critical infrastructure independencies gained prominence. This highlights growing concerns about interconnected systems and vulnerabilities. Extreme events were still noted, but the framing shifted from natural events to a more generalized extreme events, indicating recognition of extreme and diverse threat scenarios. In 2023 through 2025, the narrative evolves towards resilience and policy. Grid transformation remains a constant priority, underscoring its long-term strategic importance. Risks related to resilience to extreme events replace earlier reactive approaches, showing a proactive stance on preparedness. Energy policy appears for the first time in 2023 and continues into 2025, reflecting the increasing influence of regulatory and policy frameworks on risk management. Meanwhile, security risk persists, but the language simplifies to just security in 2025, suggesting a mature, integrated approach to physical and cyber threats. So overall, the progression illustrates a clear movement from compliance and operational reliability towards strategic resilience, modernization, and policy alignment. Here, this next slide, this table presents, similar to the prior slide, but this is the CMEP IP trends from 2020 through 2026. 2026 being the forward-looking based off the CMEP that was just released. What this slide tells us is that the NERC risk landscape is stable in its core themes, such as remote connectivity, supply chain, and security. But it's also evolving toward grid transformation risks that demand different controls and different investments. So if we start on the left here, 2020 to 2021, we really see foundational cyber and programmatic risks dominate. Those risks are access management, misops, and program execution. In 2022, the risk focus shifts from a generic to a planning operations integration, and it also introduces protection system coordination, as well as extreme events get explicit attention. 2023, we look at this as an inflection year. We see a whole slew of new trends here with IBR resources, stability studies, facility ratings, incident response, and cold weather response, all as new risk elements, which is a move from policy gaps into system performance. 2024 to 2025 and on, we have a continued emphasis on remote connectivity, supply chain, physical security, incident response, IBR stability, and facility ratings. Here, transmission planning and modeling explicitly are called out in 2025. 2026, we see grid transformation emerge as a formal risk element category, reflecting the combined impact of large-scale loads such as data centers, DERs, distributed energy resources, and aging infrastructure. So looking at all of that data, what does all of this mean? What we did was we took all the data, and what we did with the data is we looked at all the risk elements and we categorized them based on the type of risk it is. So when we categorize it based on compliance risk or strategic risk, we first defined compliance risks, and we defined those as being tied to mandatory standards or regulatory obligations and operational adherence. Simply a failure to meet them typically results in violations and penalties, versus strategic risks are those that involve long-term resilience, system planning, and emerging threats. They go beyond the minimum compliance and focus on grid reliability, so they're broader, future-focused. If you can see the list of the risk classifications, this isn't a full list, but you can kind of see based on some of the elements which different classifications we put them in. So you see remote connectivity, gaps in program execution, facility ratings. Those are the ones that we identified as compliance risks versus grid transformation, IBRs, extreme weather. Those are more of the strategic systemic risks with the broader focus. After assigning each risk element a classification, we quantified the number of strategic versus compliance risk elements that NERC prioritized year over year. That's some of the percentages you see in the left-hand column. But we'll go to the next slide and you can see even a better visualization of this data. So here, this chart illustrates the fundamental shift in NERC's risk management approach over the past several years. In 2020, the left of this chart, compliance-driven risk dominated. About 83% of the risks identified were tied to meeting specific standards and procedural requirements, while only about 17% were considered strategic. By 2022, we hit that inflection point where both strategic and compliance risks were evenly split at 50-50. From 2023 onward, the trend is clear. Strategic risks now account for roughly 75% of the total, and compliance risks have stabilized at about 25%. And this data does include the data for both reports this year. So when we look at data like this and we look at the shift, we often ask ourselves, what does this mean? What does it mean for NERC compliance? What does it mean for our programs? We start to see some patterns when we look at the trends in both the ERO risk report and the CMEP IP priorities. First, there are some stable long-term issues associated with remote connectivity, supply chain, and critical infrastructure independencies. These represent ongoing challenges that are not diminishing over time. We also see grid transformation remain a dominant priority in the risk report and finally surface on the CMEP in 2026, signaling a long-term modernization focus. We see a strategic evolution of priorities progress from foundational compliance risks to advanced grid elements. We see a shift from isolated risk elements such as extreme events to extreme weather response, suggesting a broader approach to risk elements such as weather-related risks. And finally, we see specific risks like cold weather, stability studies, or IBRs are gradually consolidated into broader categories like grid modernization and extreme weather response. Next slide. So over the past 5 years, we've achieved a 58-point strategic gain in strategic versus compliance risk, marking a rapid transformation in risk management priorities. So when you look at the data, the strategic risk focus surged from 17% in 2020 to 75% in 2025 to become the dominant priority, reflecting a shift towards addressing long-term systemic threats like grid modernization and extreme weather. Alternatively, compliance risk focus declined sharply from about 83% in 2020, all the way down to a 25% currently in 2025. Since 2024, the risk allocation has remained steady at 75 to 25 compliance, 75 strategic, 25% compliance, ensuring balanced governance while driving resilience and modernization. This evolution underscores a deliberate move from reactive compliance toward proactive strategic risk management, positioning us for sustained reliability and security going forward. With that data in mind, let's talk about strategic risk alignment. So risk management must become a holistic exercise and include representatives across the enterprise, not just NERC compliance. It means that NERC compliance is not just an insulated activity, but a component of enterprise planning and risk management. It means risks are evaluated based on how they impact strategic goals, not just operation. It means leaders across the business share a common view of what risk matters and why. And finally, it means a cultural shift to forward-looking, emerging, and strategic risks, not just compliance or historical issues. That brings us to diving in deeper and looking at a merged compliance strategy plan for 2026 and beyond. We need to take our current compliance programs and integrate strategic risk prioritization with operational compliance guidance to establish a unified compliance framework. What we're setting up here in this slide is to dive in a little bit deeper into the data associated with the 2026 CMEP, the 2025 risk report. We've done the trending. Now we want to dive into the most recent reports and see how we're going to unify that framework going forward into 2026. I'm going to hand the slides over to Brent to walk you through combining some key insights from both of these reports and the operational data.
All right, thank you, Kirsten. So as she said, we're going to dive in a little bit more into the most recent reports. We're going to talk a little bit more about the history, just to kind of give a refresh. Kirsten covered a lot of really good points about the history, but I do want to hit on a couple of things as we talk about the current state of these risks and how we move forward with those risks. So again, looking at the most recent reports, we're going to start with the 2025 risk report. There we go. Sorry about that. We're going to start with the 2025 risk. And when I say risk, the RISC report. This report was released back in August. It's their biannual report. The report comes out every 2 years, except from 2018 to 2019 when they did have a year between the two instead of the 2 years between reports. Excuse me. Again, the risk is the Reliability Issue Steering Committee. They are an industry-driven group. They are responsible for really identifying risks to reliability. I want to be very clear. This report is not a compliance report. This doesn't come out. This isn't, here's the scope of monitoring. That's your IP, the CMEP IP. This report looks at risks to the bulk power system from a purely reliability perspective. How can we keep the grid reliable, resilient, moving forward? And it's typically about a 10-year look forward. So this is definitely forward-looking. It's not just the immediate priorities. It's looking out on where we're going. So it's very, very forward-looking. And that's absolutely critical to keep in mind as you look at it. So again, this year there were 5 main risk profiles that were highlighted in the 2025 report: energy policy, grid transformation, resilience to extreme events, security risk, and critical infrastructure interdependencies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on energy policy or security risk. Security risk is something that we have been dealing with in this industry. As Jim Robb likes to say, I've heard him say it multiple times, Jim Robb, the president of NERC, we're in this toxic soup of physical and cyber threats. It's a known risk. It continues to grow. It continues to change. It evolves. Now we have these threats that are coming through as events happen, as a hurricane comes in. Now we've got coordinated effects or coordinated attacks. So it's a known risk and it continues to build. I don't want to spend too much time on that one. Energy policy, again, it's a risk as the grid changes. It has to adapt. Energy policy has to be fluid. We know that. We're seeing that in real time on day to day. We are going to touch on that a little bit as we go through these next few slides. But really, I want to spend the majority of our time from the RISC report doing grid transformation, resilience to extreme events, and critical infrastructure interdependencies, because we definitely see either an immediate impact on compliance or looking forward, trying to read the tea leaves, it is going to impact your compliance departments. So now the CMEP IP, this was just released at the end of October. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to read through it and start looking at what to expect from the regulatory side next year. The CMEP IP, unlike the RISC report, is compliance. It gives you the risks and how they're going to be monitored from NERC and the regions. NERC and the regions get together. They put this report together every year using all sorts of data that they collect and gather across the ERO. They highlighted 6 main risk elements: remote connectivity, supply chain, physical security, grid transformation, facility ratings, and extreme weather response. As Kirsten mentioned earlier, we are very, very stable in remote connectivity, supply chain, physical security, and facility ratings. Those have been risk elements that have been out there for quite a while. They've slightly evolved, but there's still risks and they're still being monitored. You go back, some of these go back to 2021. When you look at remote connectivity, it goes back even further. Supply chain has been a risk element since I believe 2023. Physical security 2023, I believe. Um, Grid transformation is a brand new one, and we're going to talk about that in more detail today. Extreme weather response is not a new one. It has been around. If you go back, you can see extreme events as a risk element going back to, I believe, 2022 and 2023. Cold weather response was introduced, and then in 2024, that evolved into extreme weather response. So it has been around and it has had some evolution, but we have seen a change this year that reflects the industry and the risks we've seen within the industry. So, with that being said, I want to jump into grid transformation. Grid transformation is a hot button topic. We've been hearing nothing but webinars, reading white papers, going to conferences, hearing speeches talking about these data centers, hyperscalers, crypto miners coming in, the changing load mix, what that's going to do, the increased interconnection queues, the high injection of IBR. In fact, just yesterday, I was at a workshop at WEC, and they put up a statistic that I thought was absolutely fascinating. In the Western interconnection in 2020, there were roughly 52 gigawatts of IBR in the system. In 2024, that's almost doubled to 100 gigawatts in a 4-year period. So we are seeing a lot of injection of IBRs. We're seeing the retirement of your traditional coal-fired, some of the old nuclear, and it's getting replaced with the IBR. So it's a completely different and changing resource mix as we move forward. Add into that all the other complexities, transmission resilience. Do we have these big lines that can support the changes? Supply chain, how is that affecting it? Grid transformation is here. It's a risk, it's a known risk, and it's a lot to take in. We're all, as an industry, still struggling to understand what that risk is, where it's been, where it's going. To illustrate that, this graphic, I'm going to be completely honest, was done with AI. I got into Copilot and I said, I need a good transition graphic. And so I started playing around with AI and I did all sorts of prompts, grid transformation. What does that look like? The impact to electric utility industry. And I went through so many prompts and even AI was struggling to keep up with it. So when we talk about it, again, it was in this 2025 RISC report, but grid transformation has been around for quite a while. When you go back in these reports, going back to 2019, grid transformation has been identified as a risk. All of these bullet points in the middle, resource adequacy, resource mix, modeling gaps, DERs, cybersecurity, grid management systems, these are all things that have been mentioned from 2019 to 2025. It's not a new risk. Grid transformation is something that we've been talking about as an industry, and it has continued to grow and evolve as the risk has changed and as the grid has changed. We're in an unprecedented era right now in terms of how much change we're going through as an industry. How do we keep up with that? How do we keep a reliable system? That's what we're trying to get at. But you go back to the 2018 report, while grid transformation was not called out specifically, these items were resource adequacy and mix, system planning, human performance, cybersecurity, situational awareness, increasing complexity of solutions. These were all called out specifically as risks within the 2018 RISC report. So this is nothing new, it's just continuing to evolve, and we have to adapt as an industry to that. Now, again, I'm referencing the RISC report. It's not compliance. We're here to talk about your regulatory programs. I still want to talk about the RISC report because I think it sets the stage for where we are on the regulatory side and where we're going on the regulatory side. So looking at the historical trend, we've talked about the evolution of grid transformation and the risk. You go back to the 2019 report, it's a much more toned down report in terms of grid transformation. It had a whole area on changing resource mix, bulk power system planning, resource adequacy, and performance. And there were some sub risks under there that have evolved to much bigger risks over time. But again, human performance, loss of situational awareness, control, and protection system complexity. Those were called out in the 2019 report underneath the grid transformation as descriptors of the risk. You go over to the 2025 report, and it is much bigger. It's got much more detail. It's much more specific. We're seeing a lot more issues. as that risk has evolved, including weather forecasting and combined events. Weather has definitely come in as a huge, huge risk, and it is evolving as we really pay attention to weather. We're having more weather related events. We're having all of these issues with IBR and trying to adapt and get data centers and understand the ride through. So we're really building on those risks, and it's evolved drastically from 2019 to 2025. So in 6 short years, we have had a huge change in that risk profile. So now on to the compliance piece. I set the stage with the RISC report. Again, not compliance. Well, now the rubber is meeting the road. We're seeing this. Compliance is now catching up to risk. The NERC and the regions did a really good job with the CMEP IP, laying out the risks and how that's going to be addressed through the regulatory side with the regions and NERC. The key here is grid transformation. It's a brand new risk element. Now there were pieces of it. Resource adequacy has been called out going back to 2015, 2016. That was always something that was there. We've seen workforce adequacy. These are issues that have been there. But when we pull in grid transformation as a whole, it really kind of gets those focal points right there. It puts them front and center under grid transformation as we see the change. So what we're seeing is compliance is catching up to risk. We're starting to see that regulatory shift. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the grid transformation risk element, it is a pretty robust risk element. When you look at the history of risk elements, there have been some that have quite a few requirements, quite a few standards. But this is a very, very significant, drastic change. This is a lot of standards. This is a lot of requirements. Grid transformation as a whole is a very, very big risk element. And when you start looking at this, it spreads from SIP all the way through OMP. It is a wide-ranging risk element. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. Also of importance is the Category 2 IBRs and that registration going into effect and the effect of these standards on those IBR registrations. You're going to start seeing a lot of these new organizations that haven't been under the NERC regulatory side that are now going to start facing some of these same issues that these established programs have, your traditional generation transmission RCBA. So we are going to see a big, big change in this, and monitoring is going to be absolutely critical. Oh, sorry, I froze for a second here. There we go. So we look at all that. We look at that wide range of standards. We look at the new grid transformation risk element. We compare it to the RISC reports. So where does the rubber meet the road for you guys that are doing the NERC regulatory stuff? Well, real quickly, I want to talk about this because we've moved this from the compliance checklist to risk-based, and we said risk-based is forward-looking. We have to start looking forward. I liken it to driving. Now that we're getting heavier into these true reliability risks that are kind of beyond the realm of just the standards, we have to be very, very focused and strategic. We have to be sure we are looking forward. We're looking down the road. We have to see and anticipate where we're going, not where we've been. It's always good to look in that rearview mirror and see where we've been, keep an eye on things, because you are going to have to verify compliance when you go through an audit or self-certification, but you have to be forward-looking. You have to be strategic. So when we talk about grid transformation, what does that mean? How do we look forward? Well, again, you've got the CMEP IP. The IP lays out the standards, the requirements. If you're on the audit schedules, you can anticipate a lot of that being included. Hopefully your COP will reflect that and you're working with your regions and you're getting full understanding of what your audit scopes look like. But you have to be prepared, not just for the audit scope, but your whole entire program. Of course, it's great to focus on the audit, but you've got to make sure you're seeing the full picture and you're monitoring everything. So that being said, we really anticipate that the regions are going to start focusing a lot more on the grid transformation. We're going to start seeing a lot more questions on the old internal control side. What are you doing? How are you doing it? How are you looking forward? How are you monitoring your interconnection queue? Your standards, you've got to pay attention to your PRC 24s, PRC 27s, PRC 5s. You've got to keep an eye on ride through. You've got to keep an eye on coordination, maintenance, and testing of all of those systems. And one of the key ones, especially as we look at this injection of IBRs, making sure that we have all of the right PRC5 components, making sure your asset inventory is up to date. If you go back and you look at the risk element specifically, PRC5 only has R3 and R5 in it. Your R1 needs to be just as perfect as your R3 and R5. If you have incorrect asset identification, you're looking at potentially compliance issues, but also reliability impacts. So you've got to really make sure that even though R1 is not in scope, you're keeping an eye on PRC5 R1. Um, One of the interesting things I heard, I've been going to a lot of workshops, and I was at one of the regional workshops this year, and kind of reflecting on that note, one of the executives at a region got up and he was doing the corporate welcome, and he really said something that stuck out. He said, "I'm not worried about these companies that have been here doing this since 2007 and even prior, before the standards were mandatory. I'm worried about the changes. I'm worried about the newer companies coming in. I'm worried about the interconnection queues. I'm worried about the protection system coordination." So it's absolutely critical that you're keeping an eye on all of this as you move forward. The proper protection system design and coordination, again, absolutely critical. Again, I'm going to point to the data center event in Virginia last year. There was a loss of load without losing load. There was, I won't go into detail. Dominion and NERC have done a great job of putting out, analysis. I believe Dominion did a white paper. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get a hold of that white paper, but I believe it is public. So if anyone has it, it'd be great to send it to me. I'd love to read it. But they put out this white paper and they've talked about it. And essentially, there was a fault. The fault occurred. It caused the system to trip as it was designed. Data centers immediately switched over to backup power, so the load was off the system. It was a very, very significant load impact, but the protection system operated exactly as it was supposed to. So that coordination between the data centers and the protection system is absolutely critical. And we're seeing more and more of that as IBRs and data centers are coming in. We've got to have those protections. And this goes back to the blue cut fire back in the mid 2010s. We're still building on those risks, and it's critical that we pay attention to them. So from a NERC perspective, you've got to really tighten those standards and pay attention. You've got to look forward. What do we see? How are we going to get there? How are we going to manage our interconnection requests? And how are we going to make sure that we do all the proper coordination? Again, cybersecurity and physical security, we've been dealing with SIP standards for a very long time. I remember the V3 to V5 transition very, very fondly, and the fun that was. That continues to be a big issue, especially now as the interconnection queues are getting bigger, as we're starting to see more generation connect, these IBRs coming in. We've got to make sure that we focus on the cybersecurity side. This is brought in specifically when they call it out. It shows the low impact in the risk element. But again, SIP is not going away. It's only going to get more and more critical. And then last, workforce adequacy. Again, with all of the changes, the changing load profiles, the changing resource mix, we really got to look at the standards. But beyond that, we've got to look at how we operate. Do we have the right people? We have the right tools? Are they moving forward? So again, you look at the standards, but you've got to think beyond just the standards. Are we capable of handling things as we move forward with this new landscape as it changes? And again, you look at the interconnection queues and it changes drastically and rapidly. So the numbers are staggering. Again, now the numbers of anticipated versus what's going to be out there are going to be very, very different. But when you look at the numbers, they are staggering, and we've got to make sure that we've got the workforce that can address that. And again, the standards play a part in that, but you have to look beyond the standards, because what we're anticipating is this risk-based approach to grid transformation from NERC in the regions. They're going to dig in deeper. They're going to ask a lot more questions. They're going to want to see more. So they're going to look at those standards and they're going to ask more and more control questions. And they're going to want to see the depth of your program. They want to see what you're doing across. We talk about cross-sector collaboration. Yes, your compliance program says you're doing this, but I want to talk to the operators. I want to talk to the field people. I want to see what's going on out there. I want to see the processes. This is where we're going. And it's got to be a true collaboration effort, tightening all of these areas up within your regulatory compliance program. All right. I've harped on grid transformation quite a bit. I want to move to extreme weather because this one is near and dear to my heart. I mentioned earlier that I was managing the control room during the February 2011 cold weather event in Texas. I was the one telling the system operators the loads to shed. I was overseeing it, and it was not a fun day. And that was a short event. Fast forward to 2021, we are all very familiar with what happened in Texas and the South. I live in Texas. I went through that. I went through that cold for that series of days. Trying to understand the power system, when it's going to come back on, when it's going to cut off. I was glued to the ERCOT website, monitoring the market conditions, monitoring everything, the reserves. I was glued to outage maps of my area from where I live, really watching the rolling, trying to understand the patterns. The extreme weather has hit Texas hard, as well as everywhere else. But this one is very near and dear to my heart because it's not just the cold, it's the heat, it's the drought, it's the hurricanes, there's tornadoes. It's a lot to take in, and it's something that I've lived through both in the real-time operations world as well as the customer world. So it is something that I take a lot of care in as we talk about risk and we work with clients to move forward in building stronger programs. So when we look at this, I want to start with the RISC report. Again, not compliance, but it does highlight a lot of important things in the risk profile. It breaks it down into a couple of different categories. There's natural events, human action challenges, grid transformation, and industry pace. Um, Human action challenges, grid transformation, industry pace, those are all incredibly important risks. But because I want to tie this back to the actual regulatory side, we're going to focus on the natural events today. So again, you look at this list: hurricanes, tornadoes, extreme heat and drought, wildfires, flooding, extreme cold weather, ice storms. We've got these increase in events. We've got average temperature increasing. We've got low wind conditions for areas that depend on wind. When you've got a high injection of IBR, you need wind and sun, obviously. And sometimes we've got times when the wind just dies. So we've got to be able to monitor all that and adapt to it. Then you've got the bigger, less frequent things: the earthquakes, the GMDs, and the pandemics. So those were all highlighted as natural events on the RISC report. Again, not a compliance report, purely a reliability report with recommendations on how to improve reliability. But moving into the regulatory world, I want to talk about the risk elements. So you go back to 2023, and that was when weather was truly introduced. There was the extreme events before that as a risk element, but in 2023, the cold weather response was the first true weather, standalone weather risk element. And at the time, it was EOP 11. Very, very straightforward. For those of you not familiar, EOP 11, you must have your processes in place to address weather-related issues. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but it's your emergency operations plan, and it called out weather-related issues. Jump to 2026 and we've evolved. We're now on EOP 11 version 4. We've introduced EOP 12 and we've gone to version 3. And we've also added FAC 3. So those are all changes from where we were. Now, again, this is extreme weather response. EOP 11 is broad. It's emergency operations plans. You must have your plans in place. Now, it does specifically call out cold weather and extreme weather, but it's very limited in that. EOP 12 is your cold weather, which we are all familiar with lately. And then FAC 3 is vegetation management. That is not a standalone weather issue either. So looking at those, what we see is this exact language: reliability impacts of cold weather conditions and extreme weather conditions, operating in extreme cold weather, vegetation inspection for R6, FAC 3-5 R6. These requirements do not have specific weather programs. It leaves it wide open to you, the utility, to determine what is extreme weather for us. What do we look for? How do we verify it? It is not a prescriptive approach at all. And there are benefits and there are drawbacks to both being prescriptive and non-prescriptive. And this is where you have to be very, very careful as you move through the compliance piece. Going through and doing the bare minimum and not looking forward at what we've had happen in the past and what we're looking in terms of weather patterns. What is next year going to look like? You've got to look at that and you've got to understand, do we have a plan in place to build for that? Are we in a floodplain? Do we have to deal with flooding? So specificity is something that you really need to look forward to as you're building your programs for EOP 11, EOP 12, and FAC 3. Again, I do want to hit FAC 3 because it's vegetation management. It's your inspection. It's not anything beyond that. Now, if you look at the IP, they do tie it to trying to reduce fire risk, but it's not a wildfire standard. It is a vegetation management standard. And historically, it's because of contacts. We don't want those contacts from trees into lines or any vegetation into any equipment. But now it's being viewed through the lens of wildfire risk mitigation. So again, a bit of a shift in this risk element and how they view a modern risk of wildfire. So tying the two together, the CMEP, again, we talked about this, EOP 11, EOP 12, FAC 3, but then you go and you look, the RISC report calls out very, very specific things to think through. Do you have plans for hurricanes? Are you in a hurricane alley area? In Texas, we are. I go through hurricanes more than I care to admit. Tornadoes, derechos, even. Extreme heat and drought, wildfires, flooding, extreme cold weather, ice storms. Are you planning for these? One of the ones that I really like hitting on is flooding. And if you go back about a year ago, there was a lot of massive flooding in Texas, and then again, you know, earlier this year, there was a lot of massive flooding. From a utility perspective, I saw something that I had never seen. I was out and I saw a crew on a boat trying to get to a pole, and it made me think, hey, this is where I live. Flooding is not normal. We're not in a floodplain. This utility had to adapt and respond to something that they weren't really all that familiar with, and so they had to come up with a plan in that moment of how they're going to get out. They're going to monitor their actual equipment in the field, how they're going to get crews here to there. You know, you look at system operators. How are you going to get crews on shift? Do you have a place for them to stay? Do you have food? You've got to plan for these extreme events, even though they may be rare and have minimal impact. When they are going to happen and they do have a big impact, you have to be prepared for that. So when you look at EOP 11 in your plans, start thinking about these. How do we build for these things that may not happen all that frequently? The quote unquote once in a lifetime storm, once in a lifetime situation. How do we plan for that? Because you don't want to be caught completely unprepared for it. So this is tying EOP 11 to the RISC report. That RISC report really gives a lot of headway and a lot of specificity. There is one thing I want to hit on. They mention geomagnetic disturbances in the RISC report. Notice this year we do not have any geomagnetic disturbance standard or requirements in there. So even though it is a risk, it's not in the risk element. Doesn't mean to lighten up. Be prepared. Make sure you've got your GMD program. You're good to go because it is a risk. It has not disappeared. It is still out there. It's just not in the IP. So again, keep that program building strong. Take a look at everything in the RISC report when it comes to extreme weather and build upon that. Use that as a tool to build a more robust strategic program looking forward. One thing that I want to talk about, we keep talking about NERC and the regulatory impact, but what about other regulatory bodies? Because we all have to answer to markets, market monitors. We've got to answer to public utility commissions. And again, being a Texan, this is one that I know very, very well that is very near and dear to my heart, the 2021 cold weather event. You look at the timeline, February 8th started the cold weather event. And it was, as you know, very, very impactful. There were a lot of, I'll be blunt, failures in the bulk power system. Um, it was just things that happened that we weren't necessarily prepared for, and things had to change. Well, in spring 2021, the 87th Texas legislature, right after that event, they passed Senate Bill 3. Senate Bill 3 updated language of the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 25.53, to require additional winter weatherization and preparedness within the EOP submittal. So every year, every utility in Texas has to submit emergency operation plan to the Public Utility Commission. They review it, they check for compliance, they refer back to it. When there are events, PUC staff will go back and they will refer back to those EOPs to understand what happened, what the response was. So by February 25th, 2022, 1 year after that event, the Public Utility Commission of Texas updated the revised language of 16 TAC 2553. That was now in place. All public utilities that meet the criteria had to submit those EOPs. They had to have that weatherization. They had to build these very specific annexes for cold weather, for hot weather, for hurricanes, for wildfire. There are very specific requirements. And again, this is a single reference to a public utility commission. There are 49 other public utility commissions with their own rules that have to be applied. But the point here is this was in place 1 year after the event, February 2022. Well, you go back and you look at NERC, EOP 12-2 became effective October 1st, 2024. EOP 11, the very first iteration, became effective 4/1/2017, but only required the term extreme weather. The reliability, it examined the reliability impact of extreme weather. No specificity, just extreme weather. How do you define that? When you start looking at these events and trying to get prepared, that's a very broad term. So you have to figure out how to address it. So it was in place, but it didn't allow a lot of specificity. Finally, April 1st, 2023, EOP 11-2 became effective. This was 2 years after that cold weather event in Texas and the South. That event basically came through, and Texas responded within a year. NERC moved a little bit slower, understandably, because it's a bigger entity, but that came into effect in 2023, specific to cold weather. So you have to be aware of this regulatory overlap. Just because it's not in the NERC standards, you have to know what's going on all fronts. All of your regulatory bodies, whether it's market rules through a market monitor, whether it's Public Utility Commission, regions, and NERC, whether it's their standards, there is a lot of overlap, and you have to be prepared and you have to understand that. Another example is California. California and their wildfire mitigation plans, the use of PSPS in California. Those are things that are regulated by the state of California, not by NERC. So you have to make sure you're paying attention to these. Just because NERC says extreme weather, you might have to get more specific because of these other regulatory bodies. Again, I went through and I kind of went on a slight detour with that case study, but going back to the risk element itself, focal points, you've got to identify extreme weather. Get specific, look beyond what you've had in the past, look at what could happen, and build a plan for it. Remember the simple things like how do you take care of your personnel? How do they get from point A to point B? How do they get into office? How do they get into a warehouse to get equipment to go out in the field and replace what needs to be replaced? Focus on that, not just what the standard says. There will be increased focus on weather events and risk mitigation efforts. What are you doing? How are you going to fix it? And also resiliency. We talk about that. Resiliency plans, system hardening, those are becoming much more common things that are being talked about. And this goes again beyond your EOP 11. This isn't just an operating plan. This is how are you improving your system? How are you building it better? How are you able to withstand all of these extreme events? So those are really focal points to build on that we see are areas that NERC and the regions are going to be hitting moving forward. Real quickly, I want to talk about critical infrastructure interdependency. If you're like me, you've been doing this for a while, and you look at critical infrastructure and you automatically go to the CIP standards. This is not a CIP standard, although there is CIP impact. And for those that don't know, the CIP standards, when I say CIP, critical infrastructure protection, they're your cybersecurity, physical security, supply chain standards. This goes beyond that. This is about the actual interdependence of the various utilities, the equipment that's out in the field. What impacts the electric utilities in extreme events? What is impacted by the electric utilities in the extreme events? Things like natural gas. How is that going to be sorted out? They need electricity at natural gas facilities to make sure the gas stays flowing. It doesn't freeze. Well, electric utilities, they need gas for generation. You need water, you need communications. These are all critical pieces and they all interplay together. It's a very dynamic relationship, and it's one that I think we're finally starting to really and truly appreciate as we move forward. So again, you're going to have interdependencies. You're going to have natural gas facilities within your area or a dependence on natural gas within your area. You're going to have communication networks that you depend on. You're going to have other critical infrastructure. You're going to have water, wastewater, things that need to flow. Pump stations, they need electricity for water and for wastewater. You've got to make sure that those are all taken care of. The communication is an interesting one because when you go back and you look, we're not just talking about, oh, I need a communication network to, make sure that my SCADA is communicating with the subs. The communication needs to happen between these entities. You've got natural gas, electric, water, telecom that depend on each other. What are these critical facilities? How are you going to maintain them? How are you going to keep them going? Communication is absolutely critical. So you've got to make sure you build your plans for that. And again, this is beyond the IP. This is going back to the RISC report. I want to be very clear. This is not part of the CMEP IP. This is not NERC regulatory. This is reliability. That being said, what we saw with grid transformation, the shift, we very easily can see the same thing sooner rather than later with critical infrastructure interdependency. We're going to start seeing regulatory bodies, NERC, public utility commissions, move towards how are you communicating? How are you building plans to work together? We're seeing a lot of that already on a small scale, but when you move into the regulatory realm, we really see that moving forward as a key piece in terms of where the standards are going, where public utility commissions are going, and where your organization really needs to focus. So again, I talked about all these focal points. Compliance is rapidly catching up to risk. This is something that I fully expect to see on the regulatory side. As you build your programs, be aware of it. The telecommunication, again, data exchange could happen. In 2019, the risk report had one recommendation, and I'm going to read this word for word. EPRI and the DOE should continue their work on communication alternatives, but also the use of same or similar technologies for critical SCADA data. When I read that, again, this is 2019 and we've evolved since then, but that's still a wide open area. Can you share data points between your utility and natural gas so they can see what's going on the natural gas side at their site? You can see what's going on theirs. As you start opening these, you've got to tighten the SIP standards up. You've got to pay attention to cybersecurity, physical security. You've got to make sure you're regulating access points because you're going to have potentially people who aren't part of the NERC standards that aren't regulated by them involved. So you have to be very, very cautious moving forward. All right. I know we're getting close to time, so I'm gonna go through these relatively quickly. In summary, we got rid of incident response. I want to hit this real quickly. It's not going away. We talked about the toxic soup of cyber and physical threats. It's not a risk element, but it's still incredibly high risk. You've got to make sure that we're responding, we're handling everything right on incident response. We learn from each other. That's how we improve ourselves when it comes to cyber and physical security. Transmission planning and modeling, again, it's absolutely critical. We're seeing the evolution as we have the changing resource mix, the load growth, the IBRs. The risk is getting bigger. Transmission planning is going to be absolutely critical, making sure we get the right data and we stay ahead and we understand how to maintain a steady, stable system. Grid transformation, again, it's going to continue to evolve. It's not going anywhere. It's something that we're going to have to adapt to. We've seen it hit the regulatory side, and it's going to continue to be a part of the regulatory side. All of that to say, you have to be strategic. You have to build a strategic risk-based approach. So how do we do that moving forward? Again, the landscape is changing. We're going from a stable checklist compliance, what have we done the last 3 to 6 years, to high risk. We have to start looking at these risks. We're starting to see the impacts of these risks on the standards, on the audits, how we're being audited, how everything is being managed. We have to look forward to that. Again, I like this analogy, and I'm gonna give all the credit to Kirsten for coming up with this. The Rubik's Cube, we start looking at this. You've got the NERC side, you've got risk priorities, you've got your entity impact, you've got everything going on within your organization. There's no single solution. We have to work together. You have to find what works for you. We have to find ways as an industry to work together. Cross-sector collaboration, absolutely key. Don't look at just compliance. Get out there. What's going on across the organization? How do we improve as an organization? Look at your regulatory compliance approach. The check the box stuff, it's not going to work anymore. You've got to have a strategic compliance framework. Are you ready and are you building a strategic compliance framework to look at these risks and build your compliance as it changes? Very, very quickly, how do we get there? Organizational roadmap. I want to hit just a couple of these. Again, I know we're short on time. Identify your risks, your immediate, your near term, your long term. Wildest imagination risks. Absolutely. Everything you can dream up to your organization. What is the risk? What does it look like in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years? Nothing should be crazy. And in fact, if you go back and you look at the 9/11 Commission report, they specifically said the key finding was that intelligence and policy leaders did not fully grasp the severity of the threat. Translate that to our industry, to risk. Don't let imagination stop. Don't be limited. Go out there. Whatever you can think of, start looking and evaluating that impact. Do a gap analysis. What do we have in place? Are we looking across the organization? Develop solutions, people, tools, processes, revisit controls, train, 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 train. Get buy-in from your people, train your people constantly. Stay actively involved. get involved in standards development, working groups, go to webinars, go to various and participate in organizations, NATF, NAGF, etc. All of this is going to help you build a strategic compliance program. We want to make sure that we highlight you've got to have alignment, you've got to have organizations working together, you've got to have cost focus, but you've got to start looking, what is this going to look like down the road? You've got to build for resilience, reliability, and security. With that, I know we're right at time. Maybe we can hopefully, if there are questions, get to those very quickly. But again, thank you all for your time. I'm going to speak for Kirsten. If you want to reach out, have more comments, questions, want to have a discussion, we're happy to talk to you, happy to pick your brain. If you want to talk Texas A&M football and the phenomenal season we're having, don't reach out to Kirsten, reach out to me, and I'll be happy to have that conversation. Kirsten would probably hang up on you, but we're happy to talk to you. If there are any questions, we'll take them with the time that we have left. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Brent, and thank you everyone for joining. There wasn't any open questions that came through the chat, so as you come up with them throughout the day, feel free to reach out to us. We'll send this slide deck out. Brent, if you can go to the final slide, people can see our information if they want to reach out to us directly. And again, thank you for sharing part of your Thursday with us. We appreciate it.